The World Trade Organization passes a package of deals on COVID vaccines, fishing subsidies and food. But is it a triumph for talking or a compromise too far? The war in Ukraine shows that the world needs to get its food from more different places, warns the UN body charged with feeding the hungry. Hello and welcome to World Business Report. I'm Jonathan Josephs. Welcome to you wherever in the world you're watching from. We start in Geneva, where the world's trade ministers have reached a series of agreements that the head of the World Trade Organization says will make a difference to the lives of people around the world. That comes despite mounting trade tensions which over the pandemic, which have meant that this was the first gathering for nearly 5 years. The 164 countries who make up the WTO agreed deals on access to COVID vaccines, fishing subsidies and food exports. Here is the head of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala.
In response to the ongoing shocks from COVID-19, the declaration you just adopted will make access to medical supplies and components more predictable in this pandemic and in the next one. The TRIPS waiver compromise will contribute to ongoing efforts to deconcentrate and diversify vaccine manufacturing capacity so that a crisis in one region does not leave others cut off. In response to the worst food security crisis in decades, you have taken steps to make trade in food and agricultural inputs more predictable and hence prices less volatile.
Well, our global trade correspondent is Darshini David, and she joins us now. Darshini, this deal on COVID vaccines seen as something of a breakthrough here, but it does have its critics. It's not quite everything that Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala there was hoping for. Just run us through it and what difference it will make to people who still haven't had a vaccine around the world.
Well, look, any of us who are in Geneva, as I was earlier this week, can't deny the commitment that went into trying to get agreement between 164 different countries on this and a number of issues. And up until even perhaps hours ago, it looked pretty uncertain whether we were going to get any agreement whatsoever. So we can't deny this is, as the WTO says, a triumph on some level. But as you say, there's a number of things to look at here. And when we're looking specifically at the issues around vaccine waivers when it comes to intellectual property, the big question is, does this really solve the problem? And the problem is that at the moment, 10 billion doses of these vaccines, less than 1% of those going to the very poorest countries. And there's not much this can change, perhaps, in the shorter term, because if you look at what's actually been agreed here, for the next 5 years, the recipe behind those vaccines can be shared amongst producers in other countries. But the real problem at the moment, one official was flagging to me, is that we've currently got a surplus of COVID vaccines. The problem is how you get them out there to the people who most need them. So perhaps more effective would be an agreement for more cash to be spent by richer nations to make sure there's the infrastructure to deliver these doses around the world and the know-how as well. And don't forget, of course, this agreement doesn't go as far as covering other areas, for example, tests and treatments for pandemics. And this whole deal was about looking at past pandemics and future and how you prepare for those. So there's a long way to go. So
a lot of progress there, much heralded. But there were also a bunch of other agreements. Run us through those briefly. And just what does all of this achievement mean for the World Trade Organization, which coming into this meeting was facing a lot of criticism that it wasn't really relevant, it wasn't achieving anything much for the world's population. Does this now make it a relevant organization with all the trade tensions that we have going on around the world?
Well, it's been interesting, as you say, a number of areas here. So, for example, we've got some agreement on reducing fishing subsidies, a rollover of agreement which keeps tariffs off e-commerce, things like digital products such as films and software, also other areas as well, some limited lifting of export controls which will help the likes of the World Food Programme feed the poorest in the world. So you can't say that this isn't an organisation which doesn't have some effectiveness and relevance. I mean, we saw what happened this week alone, which, in the face of a war in Ukraine and a cost of living crisis, it's making a material difference here. But what it does underscore is how difficult it is to get agreement when you're making those decisions on the basis of consensus between nations with very differing needs and demands out there. And the really tricky issues, well, they've been thrown onto next year and the next conference, I'm afraid to say.
Brilliant. Darshini David, thank you very much indeed, our global trade correspondent there. Now, one of those deals at the World Trade Organization was indeed about food security, and that includes limiting restrictions on exports. Now, it comes as the chief economist of the World Food Programme, which is the UN body charged with feeding the world's hungry, has told the BBC that the world has been too reliant on a few key food exporters and must increase the number of countries from which food comes. Ukraine was one of the world's top exporters before the war, but that's now trapped millions of tons of grain in the country, leading to warnings of famine. Dr. Arif Hussain was speaking to my colleague Aaron Heselhurst, who began by telling him just how bad this global food crisis is.
On a scale of 1 to 10, this is 10 plus. And the reason why I say that, and I don't say that very lightly, is because Ukraine is a food basket, a global food basket for about 400 million people. And you know, when that gets disrupted, you feel the repercussions, not just in Ukraine, but around the world.
Do you think the UN, the World Food Programme, have been too reliant on one source nation for its supplies? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, 40% of wheat aid you used to get from Ukraine.
No, I will say the world has been too reliant on very few exporters. You know, when you look at your wheat, corn, soybean, coarse grains like millet and sorghum, less than 10 countries provide like 80-90% of that grain. Less than 5 countries hold the stock up to 80-90% of those grains. When any shock happens to any of these big ones, you find the repercussions around the world. So one lesson which comes out of this crisis is that we must diversify our export base, enlarge our export base, so we are not in this type of situation going forward. Same goes for reserves. You know, here's the funny thing. As an investor, you would never just buy one stock or one class, asset category. You would diversify. That would be the smart thing to do, no? But for global food security, we are not diversified. How does this make sense? And what really bothers me is that this is not a new issue. We went through this in 2008. We went through this in 2011. We went through this in COVID. And now again.
So we're not good at learning our lessons.
No, we are not. And you know what? Let me just say that I hope that countries rethink their agricultural policies, countries rethink their energy policies. If not for the environmental sake, rethink it from your economic security and your political security.
And you can see more of that interview with the World Food Programme's chief economist, Dr. Arif Hussain, on Talking Business with Aaron Heselhurst this weekend here on BBC World News. The times are on your screen now, with the first airing at 23:30 GMT on Saturday. Now, it's been a pretty poor week on the world stock markets for investors who are concerned about the impact of rising inflation, which has led central banks, including the US, the UK and Switzerland, to all increase their interest rates. And let's have a look, if we can, at the markets here in Europe this morning. You can see there is a little bit of good news, maybe something of a rebound, people looking for some bargains, but in Japan and in the US yesterday, things weren't doing very well. So let's bring in Michael Hewson, who is Chief Market Analyst at the trading firm CMC Markets, joins us from Southern England. Michael, I guess the question everyone wants to know is how bad is this going to get? But also, is there anything that policymakers can do to ease the concerns of investors at this stage?
Well, I think if you're thinking in terms of policymakers, then there needs to be a fiscal response. And we are seeing some evidence of that, particularly in the UK. But this is really about concerns about rising inflation. We've seen a significant pivot this week on the part of central banks, not only the Federal Reserve, who hiked by 75 basis points, the Swiss National Bank also pivoted quite significantly. They weren't expected to do that. And I think it's that pivot, those concerns, those elevated concerns about much more entrenched inflation that spooked markets. And that suggests to me that despite the rebound that we're seeing today, that the risk is probably for more downside over the course of the next few weeks.
Thank you very much, Michael Hewson of CMC Markets. That's all on World Business Report. More in a few hours' time here on BBC World News.